Yes, totally. I do. Perhaps a few words about why and when and how, but I was originally born in Manchester in the UK, and I've been living in Berlin, Germany for 30 years. And I spent years in the 80s in parts of Germany. I've traveled all over Europe. I have contacts all over Europe. I work all over Europe. And over the years, I've come to feel much more European than British, to be honest. So yes, I do, totally. Well, I didn't know at the time, but looking back, I think it was traveling through Eastern Europe in the 80s, in the 1980s. I spent 2 summers hitchhiking across Eastern Europe and getting all the visas and seeing how I had to organize that. And then I lived in Leipzig in East Germany in 85 to 87. So I spent 2 years on the other side of what was then a divided Europe, the other side to the side I had grown up in. And so I experienced the other half, as it was then. And so looking back, I think it was when the Berlin Wall fell and the whole process of this coming together was the moment that was formative for me concerning Europe. I also have friends, colleagues who grew up the other side of the divide. And so I felt that I experienced both sides in the 80s quite intensely. And that certainly contributed to the idea of Europe to me. That then changed for the good. I think the worst moment in recent European history has been the inability of the European Union in particular, because when we talk about Europe, I don't always mean the European Union. It's bigger than the European Union. But the inability of the European Union in particular to find a coherent policy on migration and refugees. The sad lack of agreement on how to face this issue. I don't have the answer, but I do think that politicians should be doing a better job of working together on this. And I think the European Union has failed miserably because of national interests, national politics. Well, it isn't really a moment, but I think it's freedom of movement. I think it's the freedoms that the European Union has created, particularly freedom of movement, and the dropping of borders, the removal of borders of all kinds. So it's not really a moment, it's a process that's been going on for many years, and that's the most successful thing I think the European Union has achieved. But it's a moment associated with some of the work I do. I teach at a university in Germany, and I have one course which is called European Identities, and I teach students from all over the world in this course. They're not only from Europe. And their perspectives on Europe and how the students from other parts of the world see this freedom of movement, and how attractive Europe is to them. So my working with students, young people from all over the world, has helped me gain a perspective on Europe that I probably wouldn't have had otherwise, and how they see this. So it's not so much a moment, it's a process, but it's also talking to people, listening to people, seeing how they see Europe, people from outside of Europe too. Probably Erasmus. I was fortunate in 1987 when I was a student to get, I was doing a master's at Nottingham or Norwich, I don't know, and to get an Erasmus grant as a so-called free mover, and to go to Frankfurt am Main to do some research. And I've also been on the other side of Erasmus in my capacity as a university teacher, university lecturer. I've used Erasmus money to travel around Europe, to take students around Europe, to do projects with European universities, European students. And so for me personally, Erasmus is something the European Union has given to me, and it's given me great benefits, getting to know Europe, getting to know people, working with people around Europe, traveling, and mobility for the people I work with. Yeah. And that's a great program. Well, there's two things, if that's okay. I'd like the idea of European Union citizenship to become more established and better known. Most people don't know that in the European Union, don't know that they have European citizenship, although we have certain rights associated with it. And so I'd like that to become more widely known and appreciated. And I think the European Union has a lot of work to do to tell that story. And secondly, I would like to see the the far right in Europe losing ground and becoming less influential, particularly because, for many reasons, but also because the far right is often skeptical about the European Union and is drawing on anti-European Union sentiment. That's not necessarily a task only of the European Union. The national governments, the national parliaments, whatever it is, the national societies have work to do here. It was a book project, a very small scale book project, which I did with students. I've been teaching this program, European Identities, in a business degree. So it was looking at culture, looking at Europe, looking at history, looking at identity, looking at values, with students who were studying business. So it wasn't something they were normally doing. And I set up this program in this course, this module, which was a compulsory module, and it was been going on for several years. And then Brexit loomed. And that was my personal, if you like, stake in this. I was disappointed by Brexit. And secondly, I'd literally got bored with exams. And so I said to them, how about we do something different? And that is, you write stories. And so I had 20 students who wrote autobiographical stories, and they're episodes. They're not autobiographies telling their whole lives. They're episodes from their lives relating to the question, what does Europe mean to me? And they wrote these stories with coaching each other. They formed small teams of 4, coached each other through ideas. I coached them with their ideas. They presented drafts to me. I edited them. And in the end, the university published a book of 20 European stories called European Narratives. These are stories written by students who have seen 21 and 25, 26, I don't know, who had grown up in the European Union, had grown up in Germany. I work in Germany, but had also grown up in other parts of the European Union and were now studying in Germany on Erasmus, for example. But also at least half of them were from outside of Europe, because it's an international program. So I had students from Russia, outside of the European Union. Europe was a question there, from Kazakhstan, from Colombia, one from Cameroon, and students from France, from Italy, from Germany. And they wrote about their lives. They wrote about one episode in their lives. These stories were very, very moving, incredibly moving. And I think it was a process where the students themselves were able to learn something about themselves, but also to learn something about each other. And in a way, it's sharing perspectives on Europe and sharing views on Europe that creates a sense of what is Europe. Europe is a kaleidoscope. It's all these different stories that people have to tell. Like anywhere in the world is made of stories. Yeah. That's the project, and the university published it, and it's available on the university website. Well, something that we know abstractly, but that I realized when reading and editing these stories is how attractive Europe is. How attractive it is. And okay, I was working with the elite, I was working with master's students, students in higher education, but the attraction was made of many things, social security, freedom to say what you want, freedom to be who you are, and also the attraction of education in Europe and critical thinking, which many of these students had not experienced. And that was something they wrote about, without themselves being uncritical of Europe. There are stories in there which present a very critical view of Europe. One about the refugee crisis, which was at its height as we were planning this project. But another, there's a young student who grew up in Germany, but has parents from the Middle East, Muslim background, and her mother wears a headscarf, and her mother speaks fluent German. And she told a story called Frequently Asked Questions, which is a lovely story. And she said, why should I be a public persona just because I'm a Muslim? Because she was feeling that the press, but not only the press, people in her circle of acquaintances, friends around her, were asking her questions that she didn't feel she should be asked. She's a German citizen and a European, and why should she be facing questions about justifying what's happening in terms of a critique of Islam? That's not her role. And it was a great text. And there's a number like that. There's a text by a young woman from Colombia who explains how she did everything she could to get to work and then study in Europe, and what that meant, the work that meant, the saving money, the working part-time at night, and not telling her parents because she didn't want to disappoint them. An incredibly moving story of the moment when she told her parents, I'm leaving, I'm going to Europe, I'm leaving next week. An amazing story. And she's still here, she's still in Berlin. And so the attraction that Europe brings to many people was something that was very striking in this project. But it was an emotional, these texts are emotional. It was a project about how they feel. The European students were appreciative of the freedom of movement, of Erasmus, because many of them were on Erasmus and many of them had been on Erasmus to other places. They were very appreciative of the privileges that they have. And the non-European students generally were looking to get access to those privileges. One of them, a young woman from Ukraine, wrote, imagine you'd lived your life with a box in front of your head and it only had a little hole in it. And you've been looking through that hole and that's the world you see. And then I came to Berlin and to Europe and somebody took the box away and I could suddenly see so much more. So I think the difference was that the European students, the ones who'd been through the European education system, were already aware of the privileges and critical of Europe, and the others were looking for those privileges, those freedoms. Definitely, mobility projects make a difference. I've taken, and I mean, my world is education. You know, that's where I work. So, but I've taken students not only to many places in Europe, but to many places in the world on various projects which they've done with other students or institutions around the world. And I think, you know, we have the contact theory, meeting people, talking to people, listening to people makes a difference. And if the EU can continue to promote that and broaden those projects, I think that really helps. I did a project called Effective Communication in Multicultural Teams, which is an Erasmus funded project with 7 European universities of applied sciences, of which we were one. And it was about student mobility, but also staff mobility. And there were a number of intellectual outputs, of course. They have to be applied for, or put in the application, and then they have to be performed. But this was a 3-year project, and I think much more important than the intellectual outputs were the encounters and meetings that took place. And I think the EU is aware of this. I think when the EU provides funding, they know it's about bringing people together. And so more of that. It created intensive working relationships for the period of the project. I don't know if it had any long-lasting effect, but for the period of the project, this was a different experience of being at a university because they were doing something unusual for a business program. So it created intensive working relationships at the time. There was a German student who described how he, through various exchange programs, how he studied in Turkey, then in Poland, and then in Belarus. So he'd been around, as it were, a young man. He'd been in various places, and he told a story. And this fits so well with the European narrative that many people are skeptical about, or many people would say is now old or obsolete. Young people don't identify with it, and maybe many don't. And that's the narrative that Europe is about peace. Because he said in Poland, he got in touch with a Polish family. And he tells the story. His story is based on an incident where he was invited to dinner. And the grandfather, the old man of the family, had been a soldier in the Second World War. And he had never returned to Germany. He'd been a prisoner in Germany at the end of the war. He'd never returned or met a German since. And we're talking like, I don't know, 80 years later. 75 years later, 70 years later. And this old Polish guy gave my student the pride of place next to him at the head of the table. And they didn't have a shared language. The students at the time could not speak Polish, although he learned it later. And the old man could not speak German. But nonetheless, he was given head of the table and you know, great treatment. And this changed his whole perspective on Europe and on German history and on European history. And one of the things I do with my students is show them photographs of my grandfathers, both of them in uniform as soldiers in the Second World War. and say, you know, this story is still alive. It's part of our history. It's part of our biographies. And there was a French student in the project who wrote a story about how through Erasmus she met a young German and they became partners. So there was a romance, as it were. And then she went back to tell her grandmother in a French village. And her grandmother had lost family in the war. And her grandmother broke into tears and congratulated her. And it's just so beautiful. So the narrative of finding common ground, knowing that we have a common history, this is very important. But I think that the EU or Europe as a whole has more storytelling to do. Yeah, but we would suggest, you and me personally, yes as well. And that's what I do with my students. That's what they did with each other in this project. We did it, we practiced it. But for Europe as a whole, the media are still focused on national stories more than European stories. There's a lot to be done to bring Europe more into the common, you know, everyday life of ordinary people. There's a lot more to be done, a lot more storytelling to be done. I would say probably yes. But the EU right now has other problems. I mean, the EU now has the problem of having done such a poor job of organizing the COVID vaccines, that the story that's being told about the EU now is a story of incompetence, to be honest. And that's not good for the EU. So it's not only about stories about history and where we come from, it's also about pragmatic and practical achievements that the EU can do or not, and how they perform politically. And that makes just as much, if not more, of a difference. I don't know if you could do it on a larger scale, to be honest. I think small scale is great. I think if you bring 5 people together and they have stories to tell, that's okay. Or in my case, 21 people, me and my students, that's fine. How to do it on a larger scale, you need to bring it into the media. You need to bring it into different media. And the you know, attempts to do that are there. There are projects trying to do that. There are projects with people more prominent than myself who are presenting Europe in the media. That's where it needs to go. It needs to come into the media. Another thing I do is I use film in my teaching, and I look for films about matters European, and there aren't many. There isn't much going on where you could say that's telling a somehow European story rather than just a story based in one society. So we need more stories in the media, in the arts, in literature, and more narratives from politicians. Europe is a process. Europe is ongoing. It's not made. Made would suggest it's finished. It's ongoing. It's moving, and it's it's value driven. The values are derived from the catastrophes of European history in the 20th century. And I would hope it remains value driven, but it was also a project of economic integration. And economic integration makes sense. Democracy, yeah, international alliances, and economic exchange. It's the Kantian triangle. You know, republicanism, international cooperation, and trade. Those things matter, and I think the European Union is working, and hopefully will be working, continue to work on all three. Well, I've told you what I hope, and that is I hope that Europe will somehow work around the threat from the far right, and I hope that European citizenship will become much more current, much better known. But where it's going, I cannot say, and Europe is a project, and I imagine that in 9 years from now, it will still be an ongoing project. It won't have solved everything, but one thing that Europe does do is sit together and work out solutions to many things, and in some cases it doesn't manage, and I think it will just stay like that. I don't think it will be much different than that. It will still be hopefully 27, maybe more states cooperating to a degree on some level, and on others not managing to.